Shabbat Shalom, everyone. So, what do the Ku Klux Klan, the Jewish Defense League, and the Black Panthers have in common? Well, partially that by putting them all in the same sentence, I've probably made some of you incredibly uncomfortable and unsure of where I'm going with this. Just take the Jewish Defense League and the Black Panthers for a moment, because if you talk to people who were involved in those groups back in the 60s and 70s, even up till today, one of the things that you will know as a truth within each group is the Black Panthers and the Jewish Defense League do not get along. That's probably a pretty profound understatement. These are groups that hate each other, and for good reason. Especially back in the civil unrest of the 60s and 70s, there were letters intercepted of the intention of one group to militarily attack the other, and then this became part of an escalation of hatred and militarization between the groups, especially in New York. The only problem is those letters were not, at least originally, written by these groups. You throw the Ku Klux Klan into the mix, who also had no love for the other groups, and what they have in common is all three were part of something called Operation Pandora, which was a KGB plot to increase social unrest in the United States by doing such things as writing these letters. Now, this might sound a little conspiracy theory. This is pretty easy information to find. There's multiple books out there. There's internet archives. And this is coming from a man by the name of Vasily Mitochen, who was in first directorate of the KGB. He was a walk-in in the CIA, in the embassy, U.S. embassy in Riga, Latvia in 1992. The CIA turned him away, thinking that he wasn't credible when he talked about these sorts of activities. So he ended up being exfiltrated by MI6. The Brits thought that he actually was credible, and turned out that they were right, because they went and retrieved 25,000 pages of documents. They're all available, or most of them are available, some redacted online today. What's called the Mitochen Archives, and you can actually see what the plan was. There were multiple levels of it, and there were some incredibly violent attacks against the infrastructure of the United States that were planned as well. But one of the central ideas was to increase the unrest in the United States, to cause it to fall from the inside. Now, what does any of this have to do with the zeitgeist, with right now, with Parashat Vayakhel, and of course what I'm guessing is in most of our minds, and that is that war is happening in Europe right now. It's about 1,000 miles from where I'm sitting here in northern Germany, so it's not exactly very close. And I think it bears repeating over and over again, regardless of the complexity of the overall situation and the strange apologeticists that are out there trying to make light somehow of what's going on. But we do have an authoritarian government that has attacked a country with a democratically elected government, and that fact alone should be repeated many times over, regardless of the complexity of the politics and history behind it. And I have a feeling a few years down the road that we will see this week in a lot of the same light as 9/11, where the world after that event became different than the world before. And I think that this is probably the beginning of a phase of history that is not going to be looked back on fondly. And if you see the weariness, if not just sadness, if not depression in my eyes, it's because I don't have the wisdom to be able to talk about this. I think this is the frustration that we all feel, as we feel helpless, as we know that something really bad is going on and that we just can't do anything about it. And I know that I have received some pretty strong criticism in the past as a congregational rabbi when something has happened, and I've had congregation members saying, "What are you going to do special this weekend?" And the answer before Shabbat service is, well, I might add an extra song or two, and I might change the nature of the sermon, but other than that, nothing. Because at the end of the day, when we don't know what to do, we do what our basic ritual imperative is. In Judaism, that is, we step into how we imagine the throne room of heaven, and we enter into dialogue with a universe that we don't understand. That is what the Amidah is. At the same time, we enter into prayers called the blessings of the Shema and the Shema itself, where we look at creation moving through to our obligation. In the middle of that is we look at each other and say, we are bound together. And that is indeed the truth of this. We are bound together. And unless we are engaging every single day in prayer that reminds us that we're bound together, and every single day engaging in a dialogue with that which is greater than us, then we are going to feel helpless. And we will feel helpless even in the midst of that ritual. How much more so if we have nothing to ground us, nothing to center us. And so what am I going to do? I'm going to look at Torah. I'm going to talk about Vayakhel. I'm going to try to create some sort of connection. And if you're sticking with me, and if you are going to stay to the end of this, then maybe together we will have found something that is of some level of value. And I think in Vayakhel, the third triennial cycle, what we read this week, there are two images that I want to call to mind that I think are worth considering. The first image is the building of the Tabernacle, so the proto-temple in the wilderness. And we have this just incredible amount of detail on the steps and craftsmanship that are needed to bring this place of experiencing the presence of the eternal into existence. And the reason I want to call this into mind is I think that this is one of the passages that we tend to skip over all the detail when we read, unless we're studying to read Torah and we're having to go through and do that work and really dig into the words. I think this is one of those things that if we're flipping through and trying to keep up with reading Parashat Shavua, that we just kind of skip over the dolphin skins and the acacia wood and the posts and the copper and the gold. And I think at least at some level, we can grasp and apprehend the idea that for something to contain a presence of something universal, it takes a long time to build. And if that goes without saying, there's some reading between the lines that is worth considering. Because once it's built, then we have a choice of what we fill it with. And of course, we have a great deal of detail on what's supposed to go in it. But we also know from the larger narrative of the Tanakh that that wasn't always the case. If you look in 2nd Chronicles and 2nd Kings, you will see the story of Manasseh, the son of King Hezekiah. Manasseh, the worst out of all the bad kings in the south, and they're either good kings or bad kings, and the bad kings, well, this was the worst out of all of them. He did everything wrong. There wasn't a single thing that he did right. And if you read through the narrative of Manasseh's life, either in Chronicles or in Kings, you'll see that after he consigned his children to Moloch and the fire, and after he consulted with ghosts and witches and sorcerers and familiar spirits, that he then built altars, so this would have been in the temple compound, to all the quote-unquote hosts of heaven, meaning to all the Baals and other local deities that were around, and then he filled the temple itself, right? That thing that we have built in exquisite detail with idols of all these different gods, meaning that we can spend a lot of time building something, but it takes one person to come and fill it with stuff that we wouldn't have wanted to go in there. Just leave that metaphor hanging for a minute. The second image we have at the end of this parasha is the building by Bitsalel, the great craftsman. It's worthy of 1,000 sermons alone. But the building of the Ark of the Covenant, and we get the image of the cherubim, which has caused a lot of problems over the years, because cherubim, we think of Raphael's angels on canvas, and cherubim, that's not the cherub of Renaissance Italian art. These are really wings that were probably built, and they were wings because we have an attempt to reflect a throne room, and it's really an Assyrian idea of what a throne looks like, but the idea was the eternal is sitting on a throne proverbially, and we're called to, in our tradition, look not at the wings that are the arms of the throne, but instead the space in between. Where's the eternal? The space that we can't see, the nothingness that's there. We can't see any details whatsoever. Well, that's the eternal, but that's not what I'm focusing on right now. What I'm focusing is also in Chronicles, when the building of the temple is delineated in 1st Chronicles, we have a different configuration of the ark. We actually see that instead of facing each other, that the wings of the cherubim are actually facing the back of the inner room of the temple. And we learn in the Talmud, or the way that that is harmonized in the Talmud, is that when we were in dialogue with the eternal, when we were following the mitzvot, that the wings faced each other, and when we were not, the wings were not facing each other. And that's the other part of the metaphor that I really want to focus in on. Looking at each other, facing each other, or not facing each other. The reason that I brought up Vasily Mitrokhin at the very beginning is because if we think to, or even have a conversation with people who are involved in the Jewish Defense League or involved in the Black Panthers, that animosity is still there. It hasn't disappeared. The information of why that animosity exists has been around for a long time. Once we have begun to hate, once we have begun to enter into a process of not facing each other, but instead of facing away, facing the wall, once we have begun to lose the fact that even the people we dislike are still humans and still fall into the ethical underpinnings of Judaism, that we love our neighbors ourselves, that we love the stranger in our midst as ourselves, because we were once strangers in Egypt, and that which is reprehensible to us we do not do to another. Once we start losing sight of that, the wings get turned against the back and we are not facing each other. And the reason this is important is the amount of work it needs to take to overcome that. I've had at least one conversation in the past with someone who was involved in these groups, and the answer when I brought this up, because I've been obsessed by Operation Pandora and Matrochen for a very long time, and the answer was, yeah, well, that doesn't change how bad of people the other group were. Well, yeah, but the ontos, the beginning of that emotion, that feeling of who the other was based on someone coming in and manipulating us. That's the point that I want to get to. We know that that's the case now. Since 2016, we know, it's not a conspiracy theory, that, well, it's not the KGB anymore, that this authoritarian person who has just invaded a sovereign country, that he, along with another major country, are behind a very specific vision of how to undermine American but also Western influenced countries. One of the great scholars of the Soviet Union, writing his third volume right now on Stalin, in an interview not too many months ago, said that Vladimir Putin is incredibly aware of the might of the United States of America, the military might and the potential might of its people, and is fully aware that the only way to destroy the United States of America, and since I'm living here in Germany, I would say as well all the other countries that are in that larger traditional sphere of influence, is by tearing it down from within. And with the 2016 election, a lot of the absolute hatred came from misinformation that came from the Kremlin, not just on one side of the political aisle, as much left of center misinformation as right of center information. But just like the fact that we have literally in our hands the letters from one group to another saying, I am going to come and destroy this other group, and it was written by the KGB, we know today that the same misinformation is going on, and yet we have turned away from each other and we're facing the wall. We turned to face the wall because of hatred that was put into us by someone who has just invaded a sovereign country. And yet we are not willing to do the work to face each other once again. We hate each other now. The other political side, whoever that political side is. Remember before 2016 when we used to talk and disagree with each other? The reason we don't do that is because a person who has just invaded a sovereign country. You see, the bombs started falling here in Europe yesterday. They started falling years ago in the United States and other Western countries. We want to know what we can do at a time of war. Well, the first thing is we should really educate ourselves. If we're sitting here looking at what's happening in Ukraine and we don't understand the history of that relationship, we don't understand the 3 million people killed by Russian starvation of Ukrainians in 1932 and 1933, if we don't know that history that's still being argued by historians if that was a genocide or not, a deliberate attempt to starve a people, if we don't know that, then well, what are we doing sitting there and just hashtagging something? Let's educate ourselves. Let's start reading some books. And we can also understand that while I am clearly condemning one side, that it is incredibly complicated what happened after the fall of the Soviet Union. And the United States is not blameless in creating the animosity that exists today. It does not excuse it, but we need to educate ourselves in history. So that's the first thing we can do. We actually can tangibly read something. We can tangibly educate ourselves in the complexity of the situation. We can look and see where Ukraine is on a map. We can, as is suggested by many people, actually say Kyiv instead of Kiev, because quite frankly, Kyiv is the Ukrainian word and Kiev is the Russian word. We can respect the people as they exist. But here's the other thing that we can do. All right, a little bit like South Park, what would Brian Boitano do? I've got a how would Vladimir feel about that? You see, if we are turned away from each other and we are turned to the back of the temple now, if we are not looking at each other's eyes, and if we know that this is partially caused by a dictator who has invaded a sovereign country, and we are not willing to do any work to change our behaviors that have come from a dictator who has invaded a sovereign country, then shame on every single one of us. because that hate-filled missive that we justify because the person on the other side is wrong and the person on my side is right, that comes from the person who just invaded a sovereign country. That animus came from a deliberate attempt for us to tear ourselves apart. And the only way that it can happen is if we look at ourselves and each other and we see the enemy. And I'm not saying that we even have to see any human being as an enemy, that we step into any sort of hatred, but we are looking at each other in our own midst with more hatred than we're probably directing at the person that is behind it. And so as we get ready to type that piece of hatred, that anger, that you are wrong, that I am going to vanquish you and your silly arguments, I'm going to show you how ignorant you are, all those things that we so passionately do now on whatever feed of whatever social media we have, that thing that we say to just tear someone down. Well, the reason we want to do that is because, at least partially, of the authoritarian man who just invaded a sovereign country. Do I need to continue repeating this? It's going to take work to go back in time and to find that place where we started doing the will of bombing our own countries on behalf of someone who does want us to no longer exist as a powerful unity that we could be. Back to the idea of the tabernacle to close this out. It takes a long time to build something. Yeah, the world's not perfect around us, but we have had a type of peace and prosperity unparalleled in all human history, regardless of the negative things that are still out there. And we can either look at one or the other. We can look at the beauty of what we've built and then use that to help us make sure that we are correcting that which still exists that's problematic. Or we can look only at the flawed foundations and say we need to burn the entire thing down in order to change it. Gee, guess who is behind some of those thoughts? That's the last lesson whenever we look at how long it took to build the tabernacle or the temple. The first temple was destroyed. Well, some of the detailed reasons are lost in time, but the second, it's much more clear in our tradition. Not by the Roman army, but through sinat chinam, through baseless hatred. That's what the world looks like when the wings of the cherubim are facing the back wall instead of each other. It doesn't matter if we're sitting in a room with someone who has different values than we do. We still need to face them and recognize their humanity. We need to stop hating because we disagree, and we just start acting upon the realization that much of that hate has come from an external source. It's going to take work to turn the cherubim back towards each other. But if we want to know what we can do in a time where we feel hopeless, that's exactly what we can do. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.